Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining the webinar today. So I'm Emma Gubisch, I'm the Head of Sensory and Consumer Insight at Leatherhead Food Research, and today we're talking about the battle for consumer truth. So this is all about how important the consumer has become. They've always been an important part of innovation and product development, but the nature of development is that actually the consumer has become ever more important. When you think about all the new startups which are coming into the fray and have the latest consumer insight, they know exactly what consumers are after. That dials up the competition and just shows just how important it is to really understand consumers' needs and consumers' wants. And not only is it becoming more important, but the way that we're going about doing consumer research is changing as well, which is helping us build up this ever more nuanced picture of consumer insight and what they want. So to help us guide us through this webinar, I'm actually going to use some avatars or virtual people. So they are Amal, Juliet, Gabriel, Iona, and Lisa and Clark. And we've actually chosen to use these people because we often talk about consumers, but actually we're just talking about people. We're talking about us. We often talk about consumers, end users, customers, patients. But actually, we're just talking about people, and often our own insights can be very reflective on why we purchase things and why we buy things. So we're going to use these different people to help us tell the story of this battle for consumer insight. And just to give you a little bit of insight about what we're going to talk about today, so Amal is going to help me talk about how there's a lot of uncertainty and disruption in the world at the moment, and how we often go about our consumer insight by beginning to understand what that consumer mood or consumer zeitgeist is, so how are consumers feeling at the moment. Juliet is going to help us talk about how this idea of consumer truth is actually quite elusive and quite intangible and quite hard to pin down. Gabriel reflects this growing interest in behavioural economics and behavioural research, which is becoming very important in the world of consumer insight. Iona is going to help us think about technology and what technology is enabling us to do, not only in our lives, but in the way we go about doing our research. And then Lisa and Clark is more looking towards the future and the kind of these principles that we apply to the way we go about doing research. So if we start with Amal, so obviously Amal is a young person, and children and young people will always kind of represent the future and be disruptive in their own rights. They're often disrupting their parents, and disrupting the things that their parents have done in the past. But also they're taking on the world that their parents have created. And actually there's a lot of disruption, as I mentioned before, in the world at the moment. Just here in the UK, if you think about Brexit, whatever you think about it, it just demonstrates how very quickly a political issue can actually divide a country in a matter of a few years, and how this feeds through into consumers and their purchasing patterns and their feelings of uncertainty. It's really important to try and understand what that kind of consumer mood is and how that plays out in the way we go about buying things at the supermarket. We're also facing a lot of disruption and uncertainty on the topic of climate change. I think everyone's now of the agreement that it's no longer something that you can question anymore. And actually the narrative has been dialed up to the point where people are saying, have we got to the point now where it's actually very difficult to turn it around? So you can see the quote there about, actually we understood a lot about climate change back in 1979, including how to stop it. So a sort of lack of uncertainty and disruption from some of these really big socio-economic issues which are happening at the moment. And we do see that come through in the way people go about their shopping. So this is a consumer perception index that we've created here at Leatherhead Food Research. And it's kind of a mark in the sand to show what consumers think about the products which are available to them at the moment. And this is based on the average answers of a survey we did with consumers in the UK, the USA, France, China, and Brazil. And we were asking them to think about what percentage of products available to them meet certain standards. So you can see here the average answers. And you can see that, so in the big green bubble, 79% on average they thought 79% of products were safe to consume. On average, they thought 66% of products delight them. But if you look over to the right, on average, they thought only 54% of products are made ethically and sustainably. So you can see there that there's a kind of a feeling that the products there aren't quite hitting that mark. There aren't quite enough products out there which are made ethically and sustainably. Also on the matching marketing claims, on average, they thought 62% of products match marketing claims, and this kind of goes to a bigger issue of trust that we sometimes see, that people are cynical about the things that are said about products that are put on the pack of products, and again, a sort of a desire there for sort of a greater trust and a greater transparency on products. I also just wanted to show you some statistics around how consumer behaviour is actually changing. If you think back 20 years, how we were purchasing and what we were buying and how very different our behaviours are today. Again, these are the international statistics from the UK, the USA, France, China and Brazil. And so you can see half are trying to eat less sugar, 1 in 3 are trying to eat less meat, 1 in 3 are trying to cook more from more ingredients, a quarter are trying to drink less alcohol, 1 in 10 are trying to cut gluten from their diet, 1 in 10 are trying to cut dairy, and 1 in 6 are trying to eat more protein. And I think when you see those statistics together, you just see the extent of the change that's happening in terms of people's changing behaviour. They're quite some strong changes which are happening. And if you think back 20 years to how people perhaps were consuming products then and the kinds of products that they were actually looking for. It doesn't mean that people are actually successful in making these changes, but it shows you the kind of the desire and what they actually are hoping to achieve. And again, just this quote here just showing how consumers are looking for something different, something other than potentially those mass-produced products that we historically would have gone to, but looking for something fresh, something with a consciousness towards packaging, something different, something other. And into this market can come these new competitors, these nimble startups, who really understand the consumer need, and they can jump on that consumer need, and their whole existence is about delivering to that need. And they become very competitive in that market, even against some of the big players. And it's quite interesting that now the big players in the food and beverage industry are often talking about trying to kind of mimic the agility of those startups, but with the resources that they have being a big company. So they recognise that the value that those startups can bring when they're trying to get new innovations out into the market. And a lot of it comes from this kind of desire to try and understand what is that consumer truth that we're searching. What are consumers actually thinking? What do they actually want? So this is Juliet. So she's a young person. She's a digital native, but as you can see there, she sometimes is looking for sort of a digital detox from her life, which is full of technology. She's using her smartphone a huge amount, and she's often looking for a break from all of that. And businesses are really trying to kind of understand what's going on in her head, and this feeling that if we could just do a bit more homework or a bit more insight, we could really understand what motivates the consumer, and from that we'll have a really good hit rate on the right concept. And it can really feel for Juliet, that actually there are a lot of companies who are trying to go after her or are trying to get more information about her. Historically, it just would have been the retailer who held that relationship with the consumer, but now along the whole supply chain, wherever they are, whether you're an agricultural business or an ingredient company or a manufacturer, you've got access to the consumer, you've got access to Juliet. You can either serve her products, or you can also try and get feedback from her in terms of what she thinks about those products. So no wonder she's sometimes wanting to look for a kind of a digital detox. And there's now also a recognition that consumer insight is quite intangible. It's quite hard to pin down. There's a lot of discussion about what actually is the truth now. What is that consumer truth? I know there's a lot of discussion in the news about what's fake news, what's the true news, and a recognition that actually sometimes things are quite grey. It can be quite hard to pin down what are the actual facts, and that is the same when it comes to consumer insight as well. I've just got a little thing to show you here to kind of demonstrate it on a very small scale. But if you have a look at this slide now, and if I ask you how many dots you can see, if you just have a little look. You might see that there are actually 12 dots there, but as you look around the screen, they kind of fade in and out. So sometimes you might only see 4, you might see 6, sometimes you might even see 8, but it's actually very difficult to see all 12 dots together. And that really just is to kind of demonstrate this point that I was mentioning before, that it's very hard to always see the whole of the truth. You might only be looking at part of the picture. And so it's really important to bear that in mind when you're doing consumer insight. And that's why there's this growing interest in behavioural economics and behavioural research. So historically, about sort of 50 years ago, there was a belief in research that you would just ask someone what they think, and they would very happily just give you their response, and that was kind of taken as read, that's the truth, we'll take that answer as as gospel. But now there's much more recognition that it's much more complex than that. That people are they don't always say what they mean. There's a lot more complexity going on here, and when we particularly see that in the area of behavioural economics. So this is Gabriel here, and he's obviously busy sort of doing football there, but that's quite an interesting example, football and doing exercise in this context. Because what's happening when we're behaving, when we're making certain decisions, is that we've got two different cognitive systems which are influencing us. We have a kind of a system 1, which is much more fast, intuitive, automatic, and we have a system 2, which is much more slow and thoughtful and reflective. And it's the interplay between these two systems which actually impact our behaviour and what we do. So when we think about exercise, for example, our system 2 brain might be saying, I want to do a bit more exercise. I want to, perhaps train to do a marathon, or at least train to do at least 5K. And then you might plan to do that. But then on the actual day when you plan to start your training, your system 1 brain kicks in and says, oh, actually, I'm feeling a bit tired today. I don't know if I'm actually going to go off and do that run, or I'm going to start it. So it's the interplay between these two different cognitive systems that can really influence our behaviour. Sometimes it's often called the system 1 brain is called the sort of Homer brain, and the system 2 one is the kind of Spock brain from Star Trek. It can be quite a funny way to think about it. And as well as this recognition in the importance of behavioural economics, there's now also a recognition that very small details can have a major impact on people's behaviour. So this is a quote from a book called Nudge, and it's got some great examples in there about this very point. But if you think about how an architect designs a building, or someone designs the way they lay out the food in a canteen, all the very small decisions about how that building is made or where the food is put in the canteen will have a real impact on the choices that people make, where they go in that building, who they bump into in the building, or in the canteen, which products they decide to buy. So this quote here sort of says, well, actually, very small and insignificant details can have a major impact on people's behaviour. A good rule of thumb is to assume that everything matters, because everything has an impact on people's behaviour and people's choices. I just wanted to give you some examples of that in practice. So this is, you might have seen these chevrons on the road, so this is an example of that kind of this sort of interplay between these cognitive systems. You could have a big sign which kind of waves a finger at people and tells them to slow down or to keep their distance. But actually, by putting these marks on the road, these chevrons on the road, you're kind of getting people to use their automatic brain, and they're sort of automatically leaving that distance between the car, because they're almost seeing it like a game. I'll see if I can try and keep 2 chevrons distance between me and the car in front, rather than actually having to make an actual decision to follow a rule that's on a sign. I don't know if this is something that you've seen at the Schiphol airport in the urinals, if for any of our male listeners. This is quite a clever idea to focus people's attention. So they etched a very small fly into one of the urinals, into the urinals at Schiphol Airport. And here they're basically encouraging people to focus the attention into one direction to actually prevent spillages in the urinals there. And actually it's apparently had a very big impact. So it's, again, a demonstration of a very small thing, but actually having quite a major impact on what people do. And this final example is about the organ donation register in the UK, and how they changed it from an opt-in register to an opt-out register. So the status quo is that you have to now opt out of it rather than to actively opt in it. And they've increased the people on that register because of something called the status quo bias, where people tend to just kind of stick with the status quo rather than to actually actively do something. So by making the status quo, that everyone's already on the register, you get less people who actually actively then choose to opt out. And so we really believe at Leatherhead that it really is about trying to understand the dynamics of human behaviour and the patterns in people's behaviour that's going to help us get a much better understanding of consumer insight and how consumers will respond to new innovations and products. So that leads on to another huge change in our world at the moment, but the way technology has come into our lives and what that can enable us to actually do. So this is Iona, and a bit like Juliet, she's grown up with technology all around her, and it's just part of her life, and she can't live without it. It's become such a key part of her life. But when she looks at her iPhone, she begins to see the extent of what she's looking at, who she's connecting with, the apps that she's using, how long she's on the iPhone for, which is, can be an amazing amount of time actually when it's sort of averaged across the week, and just shows, suddenly in the palm of our hands, we have this technology which enables us to interact with different people, and also from an insight point of view for us to start to understand much more about her behaviour and her attitudes and her views, what she's looking at, what she's interested in. So a huge kind of window into the world of our consumers. And it means that her sphere of influence has really increased. When you think about the old world or how it used to be, it kind of used to be just friends and potentially professionals. If you think about the sort of beauty industry, that might be influencing us, friends and family, obviously important as well. But now, with the advent of technology and bringing us closer to different groups of people, suddenly our sphere of influence has grown massively, and it's grown out to our social media contacts, to bloggers, people that we've never even met, and these people are having an influence on our behaviour. And as well as our smartphones, we're now looking at how technology is going to become part of our lives, whether that's in our homes to help us measure and monitor our utilities, or with wearable trackers and devices to measure our own heart rate and sleep patterns and steps, to voice recognition software, which enables us to access our choices and to search for things online instead of having to type them into an actual device. And all of these devices are collecting and measuring information about our consumers and about behaviour, and give a real understanding of how people engage with the world. And it means that it's also changing the way people interact and the choices that they make. So this is an example here of Alexa being able to recognise a slight change in this lady's voice and recognising that she actually has a cold, and asking if she'd like a recipe for chicken soup, and then even offering if she'd like to order some cough drops. So it really changes that interaction and our purchasing patterns because of the way the technology is coming into our lives. This is an example of a picture that can be printed in cocoa on the top of a coffee. So that sort of idea of how technology can personalise things for consumers. And on the right-hand side, the smartphone there, giving people directions to their office or their usual, the place that they're off to, but then also suggesting where they can stop off and pick up their coffee on the way. And obviously the next step is then for that coffee to be ready and waiting for them, when they arrive there in 6 minutes' time. And we're also seeing how technology can create greater experiences. This is an example of something that was on at the Saatchi Gallery, where people could put on virtual reality headsets and imagine what it was like to go inside a forest, and not even beyond that, actually go inside a tree and to try and experience what it might be like to be inside an actual tree. So technology really changing and augmenting our lives. You might have seen examples of augmented reality where you're using this kind of mix between the virtual and the real world, perhaps using apps on your phone where you've perhaps been able to show, dinosaurs roaming around where you're standing, or there was a great example from Heinz where they were creating a recipe booklet that you could augment onto a product as well, and it's onto a Heinz ketchup bottle, and then it kind of leafs through the recipe booklet. So that sort of real sort of interaction between the virtual and the real world. This is a supermarket in Milan in Italy, where there are now screens in this particular supermarket above the different products in the supermarket, telling you information about where those products have come from and the journey that they've gone through. And then using technology like blockchain, you can actually have a record of an undeletable record of where that product's come from, how many miles it's gone through, the suppliers on the journey of that product. And as consumers become more interested in ethics and sustainability, this kind of information is then able to be shared with them at the point of purchase. So technology is really changing people's lives beyond recognition, and it's also changing the way that we can do research and the insight that we can gather about consumers. The old world used to be, of consumer insight, used to be quite focused, as I said, on asking people particular questions and asking about particular choices, and quite narrow. And now having these devices enables us to supplement these kind of techniques with a much broader range of tools and insights to help us build a much greater in-depth picture of consumers and what their experiences are and what they want from their products. And these are just examples of how in the beauty industry there's so many different ways to diagnose people's different skin conditions and to measure and monitor changes in people's skin. Because in these examples where they're using sensors, they're able to measure things which actually it's very difficult for consumers to measure themselves or to comment on. They might be able to give a qualitative assessment of feeling that their skin or their hair is improved, but actually these kind of tools can give much more detail around whether a change has actually occurred, and to actually give that sort of diagnostic information back to consumers themselves. So I think it's really exciting what technology can enable us to do in terms of a greater understanding. But we at Leatherhead also believe it's really important that technology shouldn't just be our masters and we just go with technology as it's developed. It needs to be an important narrative between the developers of technology, but also consumers and users of it, so that we just don't blindly use it, but that we are all part of that narrative and how that technology is being developed. Because there are obviously questions around the way this data is collected and how it's stored, and whether consumers are aware of how much information is being potentially collected about them. So we really believe it's important that these discussions are had alongside this development, and that there is honesty and transparency about how this research is conducted. Historically, we abided by the Market Research Code of Conduct, but now in this new world, we need to think about the standards that we apply to the way we do research. So what about the future for consumer insight? Well, we very much believe in considering the whole product ecosystem, so nothing exists in a vacuum. We always we think about it as this onion where, at the center you've got the product or the sensory experience. Around that you've got the way the product is actually positioned, so it's branding or marketing. Then you've got the context in which the consumer will interact or experience your product. And increasingly that may no longer be the actual retail space. They might be getting it directly to their home, or they might be actually going to a much more experiential retail space where they can not just buy something but actually try it out for themselves and decide whether they want to keep it. And then that broader sort of outside circle, the consumer mood or the zeitgeist, which I talked about at the beginning, is understanding what is that mood at the moment. Is there that feeling of uncertainty? Is there a more positive feeling? Trying to understand that and what that means for your products and your innovations. And we really believe it's about blending the three different methods of sensory science, consumer attitudes and behavioural science. So Leatherhead has a strong heritage in sensory science and consumer insight, and now we're bringing in that behavioural science as well, because we believe the three really build that whole picture, that holistic picture of consumer experience. And so the future is very much going to be in this sort of fusion of offline and online worlds in the way we go about doing consumer research. We very much believe it's not about getting rid of the best things that of the past. We need to keep the great consumer insight techniques that we had. Qualitative research is still going to be really, really valuable. There's never anything as good as sitting down and talking to someone to really understand what they think about things. But that then needs to be blended with our ability to understand consumers in the real time and collect that data as they're experiencing something. So that human experience in the real time is going to be really, really, really vital, because you're getting much more engagement in the research. You're getting something which is closer to real life. It's the difference between that reflective brain and the automatic brain. Our research was often in that reflective space, and now we're able to capture people in that automatic space when they're actually making the decision of what they're going to do. And we have to, our insight will be reflecting the fact that human experience can be messy and complex and very nuanced. That is the nature of human experience. That you can't just pin it down to one point in time to understand our interaction with a product. We need to understand it across across the life cycle. So when we purchase the product, our experience of it, and then how we feel about it when we no longer have it. Do we actually miss it? That whole kind of breadth of human experience. And as I said before, technology will be a really vital, important part of consumer insight to heighten our understanding of human experience. But it's really about not allowing it to be our masters, for us to decide how we use it and to use it in a responsible way when we're trying to understand consumers and their behaviour. So I hope today I gave you a little insight to kind of how our philosophy is developing at Leatherhead Food Research around how there is this real battle to try and understand the consumer and how consumer insight is developing to think much more about behaviours and how the complexity of human experience, how technology is enabling us to get closer to the consumer, but also what that means for the future in terms of blending the great things we did in the past, but also with the exciting developments that are in the future as well. So thank you very much for listening to the webinar. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Sophie Parker. I think she's been looking at the questions to see if anything's been coming in while I've been talking.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much for that insight. If you do have any further questions, then please do type those in the Q&A panel. A couple that have come in while Emma's been speaking. So the first one here, for companies with established products that have been around for a long time, what can be done to make the brand company stay relevant to current consumers?
I think it is a tricky one. When you're developing a new innovation, you obviously, you can start right from scratch. You can work out what that consumer insight is, and you can design something for that consumer. When you've got existing products, you're dealing with a different kettle of fish. You're dealing with potentially a heritage product, which has a signature recipe potentially, or a signature look and feel if you're talking about marketing. And you're really thinking about, is that product fit for purpose now? Is it what the market wants? And actually, you're thinking, is it something that is the market moving away from this product? Do I need to try and develop it and improve it? Or actually, is the market moving so far away from this product that actually it's more about me managing my exit from that product and focusing my innovation in another area? So I think it's very much dependent on the product, but you're thinking about, potentially managing your exit with that product from the market.
Thank you. And then just one other one that's come in here. Do you agree that as competition becomes more tense, that it becomes harder to sell based on just the product? Selling the experience is a new marketing trend.
Yes, definitely. The experience is almost becoming more important than the product itself. Well, I say that hesitantly because the product itself is a key part of the experience, obviously, and particularly from a sensory point of view. But yes, it is very much about experiences now. Companies talk about selling experiences, and they think about how that can transcend from the product to the retail space and how they tell that narrative in that space as well. So yes, it's definitely a sort of a change in the way companies talk about what they're selling.
Cool. So I think that's probably all we've got time for. I can see that there has been another couple of questions come in. If you haven't had your question answered, then we will make sure we get in touch with you in the next couple of days just to send our response to those. We will be sending around a copy of the slides, a recording of the webinar, and we are also writing a white paper around this topic, which will be available to members. So please do watch out for that email, which will be coming in the next few days, containing all of those things. They will be available on the Leatherhead website. So if you missed that email and you do remember, then please come and find us on the website. And if you want to share any of the recording or the white paper with people within your organisation, that's great as well. We do have another webinar coming up for members on Wednesday, the 6th of November. This will be focusing on the importance of conducting a regulatory environmental review from our regulatory team. So please watch out for registration details for that webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you all then. Thank you very much for everyone who's taken the time to listen today.
Yes, thank you very much.